Hi, this is the Global City Mission podcast. I am Jared Looney, the executive director of Global City Mission, and I'm here today with Ben Cheek. Ben kind of has a dual role. He's the executive director of a camp in New York, in the New York metro area. Ben, what's the name of the camp again?
Camp Deer Park.
Camp Deer Park. Okay. I want to make sure to ask so I wouldn't get it wrong. Okay.
Thanks.
Ben is also a regional mobilizer for Global City Mission and the Metro New York area. And Ben and I worked together years ago in Metro New York, doing church planning work with simple churches, house churches, and building team and developing people together. And that was a lot of fun. And we have a lot of that history. And we've come back together and are working together in Global City Mission and partnering as well with the network of churches that are connected to the camp that he also runs. And so, Ben, it's probably after saying all that, easy to say that you're a busy guy.
Sure, you could say that.
For sure. In a article that Ben and I put together that you can find over at the Mission Alive Substack. Ben, you talk about standing in a cold New Jersey lake, baptizing more than a couple of dozen people that were new believers. These were not churchgoers. These were people that came from a lot of different kind of backgrounds, Jewish, New Agey, all kinds of different things. I think they refer to themselves as Oprah-ish.
That's a term we use sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but they encountered Jesus and wanted to become his disciples. And so today, the conversation we're having is about post-Christendom. Global City Mission emphasizes three mega shifts that in our culture that we really have to think about in terms of ministry and mission. Of course, one of those is urbanization. That's not just about place. It's not just about density. It's really about how culture changes as you have a more urban society. And we've talked about that more in other places. We'll talk about it again. We also talk about global connectivity, and we've talked about that in other places, and we'll talk about it again. But today we're going to talk about post-Christendom, and that's a third mega shift that Global City Mission focuses on and really points to in terms of the direction of ministry and really engaging that from a mission perspective. And when we use that term, it's probably important that we define it a little bit. Cultural Christendom is a society where Christianity has a dominant influence. I would personally argue, Ben, that I wouldn't call North America Christian in our history because we've done too many non-Christian things. but it's not difficult to argue that Christianity had the dominant influence, kind of in the marketplace of religion, And so, we had a cultural Christendom that's different than Europe and its state church, but we had churches in European countries, but we had a cultural Christendom here in the U.S. And so, that's where Christian institutions kind of hold the dominant position, and Christianity has a dominant influence in the culture. But post-Christendom is really a society where those assumptions that were once true are really no longer true. That it's more religiously diverse, pluralistic, and more secular all at the same time. And a lot of times people talk about one thing. It's really more than one thing. It's religiously plural, it's diverse, but it's also more secular. All those things are true. I think one of the popular observations that's taken place that faith leaders are real aware of is the rise of the non-religious, what's called the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. And that's if you ask a question, what's your religion? They'll say nothing, none, unaffiliated. Now, the percentage of population in the U.S. that will answer that question, no religion, is up to about 29-30%. That's nearly 100 million people. That would be one of the top 20 countries by population in the world, just our non-religious population. So I think it's way past time we think of North America and the West as a place to engage with kind of a mission mindset. And Ben, you spent a lot of time serving people in context and ministry context over the years that we would describe as post-Christendom. Religiously diverse, spiritually diverse, maybe kind of patchwork of spiritual worldviews. secular, definitely kind of a rejection maybe of traditional Christian institutions. Share with us a little bit of what you've experienced helping people encounter Jesus, maybe outside of some of those traditional boundaries of Christendom that they've largely rejected. What does that look like for you?
Right. I think that I would frame it as kind of two different main places where people are post-Christian. One would be post-institutional, and the
Mm-hmm.
other would be post-Christian or post-Christendom, right?
Mm.
And it isn't necessarily that it can't be both of those at the same time, but when I first started work, it definitely was people who still found the Christian story compelling and had high exposure to it, but yet couldn't find their place within Christian institutions. And so, especially in the urban context, you'll find tremendous population groups that have some kind of Christian memory and openness to Christendom, but there's no space for them in institutional layers.
Mm.
And that is important that we see that um, as part of this, uh, because this isn't a single discrete phenomenon. This is a complex of phenomenons. So you can have somebody, and I've worked with a lot of people who would consider themselves part of the gospel project, but define themselves as spiritual but not religious, and
Mm-hmm.
they're actually making a very anti-institutional claim. You can even find people that consider themselves evangelical born again and yet don't identify with the institutions of Christendom. So there's that. There's also people that very much would find themselves accepting a lot of stuff Christian, but they can't find a place within the institutions. I mean, this was part of my initial work in urban neighborhoods, helping people without the burden of real estate or clergy for a Christian community. There's that layer. And then there's the layer of people that see themselves outside of the meta narrative of the Christian and the Christian story. And so I've worked in all of those. My first real exposure to that last category was a young man who had rejected Christianity, at least as he knew it, because the Catholic Church had excommunicated his mother through a divorce. And so that was his primary story, was that story. Now, he was an artist and had been educated in the New York City arts community. And because of that, he was very postmodern as well, which is another shift that's tied to the post-Christian shift. Not only are people post-Christian story, they're also post-modern truth structures. And when you're talking about an artist, there is no group of people that are so far outside of the modern truth structures as people in the arts community. So
Mm.
that was an interesting experience, and for me, it was really an eye opener, because at that point I knew how to say to somebody, "You ought to follow this story that you know is true." That's what I knew. That's what I was spiritually trained in. You ought to be obedient to the story that you know is true, or at least most of us say is true. And it was a big shift going into, hey, how do you help somebody find Jesus when you can't? None of those rules apply. You can't call on any of those things. And so that was really interesting. And what I discovered in that space is we need to understand that Jesus is definitely about truth, but in some ways he's just as effective if you move outside of objective truth. He's just as effective if you can just focus on subjective truth.
Mm.
What is true for this artist
Mm-hmm.
right now, that then shows them Jesus, that shows them the truth, the person who is the way, the truth, and the life. And so in this guy's case, his fundamental barrier between him and God was this idea that religion and therefore spirituality. Now, he believed in spirituality, but not necessarily um, spirituality that could make a claim on you,
Mm-hmm.
but more spirituality that was an experience.
Mm-hmm.
But the biggest barrier was this idea that somebody said to his mom, "You went through this unfortunate incident, and now you can't come to God."
Mm-hmm.
Right. So
Mm-hmm.
the interesting thing, we built a relationship. He said that he needed human subjects to paint. He was an oil painter. And so
Mm-hmm.
I volunteered to be a subject, and he
Mm-hmm.
painted me and we talked. But his real gospel experience was actually a tour he and I had at the Met. We went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and we were walking through, and I had commented on the symbology of temples and shrines in Asian art, because they
Mm-hmm.
always have these soldiers, these ferocious generals, these demon dogs, these dragons. They all have these really like ferocious characters,
Mm-hmm.
making sure the profane does not approach the divine.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you're really holy, really scrubbed down, really pure, you can't come in here. Right. And so we went through all this, and we're remarking on it, and he's actually kind of getting angry, because this is his spiritual issue. This is what hurt his mom. This is why he doesn't want this. And I said, "Show me one of your favorite paintings." So we went to the European section, and because he was an oil painter and he was in realism, he loved Caravaggio. And he showed me this painting of Caravaggio of the Holy Family. And here is Mary, a teenage mom, with Jesus standing on her lap. And there's this pudgy little wild John the Baptist who's a toddler, and he's reaching out his finger to poke Jesus. Right? But before he can get his finger and poke Jesus, there's Joseph standing there pulling back his hand. The same, like, demon dogs, ferocious generals. You can't touch the divine. He's too holy for you. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And I said to him, this is both a beautiful painting and a tragedy. Because if you really want what this scene looked like, Jesus and John would be playing on the floor. Because the whole idea of Jesus, even to the point that he wanted to go to the cross, was you can bring as much of your humanity in here as you want, I'll still be divine.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of like trickled its way down into his soul as we walked out of the Met, and we got to the rotunda, which is this big open area. And I think he's a very quiet guy, but he made like the loudest noise he's ever made in his life. He went, "Oh," and it just echoed.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the point where he saw Jesus aligned to his spiritual journey. What would it look like if God is so unafraid of us that he would come down into our human condition and be right here and right now? So, my experience overall of post-Christendom is being very incarnational. And
Mm-hmm.
how do we get more incarnational in our approach? How do we go into people's subjective experience, find that subjective truth, show them
Yeah.
that Jesus is the master of it, and whether it's one person or a community, we build from there.
That's really interesting, Ben, because in my experience, in conversations with Christian leaders and in churches and in missions, we often see the idea of objective truth and subjective truth being in conflict. The subjective is the idea that like it's kind of like it's non-truth, it's in conflict. And what you're saying is, subjective is that. I mean, that's just personal experience, and the same ones of us that are really trying to champion that objective truth of God, of the Creator, which that's all true. But the same ones of us trying to champion that, we're also into the personal Savior bit, and so if he's personal, can he meet us in our subjective experience? And so that sounds like that's the kind of thing you were trying to facilitate, is just trusting that Jesus is personal, and that he can meet us there. And so instead of seeing those things in conflict, really meeting someone where they're at.
Right. You can't look at Jesus and how he connected with the Samaritan woman, how he connected to the woman caught in adultery, how he connected to Nicodemus,
Mm-hmm.
and see a person who makes interpersonal arguments to just objective truth. He is willing to start with the subjective.
Yeah.
But he understands that if you connect to the subjective and you fall in love with Jesus on a subjective level, you will beg for his view of reality. You'll beg for his view of the universe. And then it goes to the objective truth.
That's really
So it's a
beautiful.
matter of where we start from. And when we find ourselves demanding that people join us in objective truth before we're willing to listen to or connect to their subjective truth, what we're really doing is trying to defend our institution.
Yeah, yeah, and you said something earlier. This idea of I'm spiritual but not religious. There have been studies of people that claim no religion, that claim nuns, unaffiliated, and I can't remember the exact statistics, but it's up somewhere around 3/4 of respondents would describe, of people that say they have no religion would also describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, and I think there's kind of this assumption that everyone is hightailing it away from any form of spirituality, and that's just simply not the case. They're still interested in asking the existential questions, the transcendent, the divine, the spiritual encounter. But there is kind of a breaking down of some of those traditional categories and trusting some of those traditional institutions. Listen, you're also in this role with a Christian camp that serves over 100 churches a year. And so you're able to kind of process with them. You're a missional influence among these churches. From the church's perspective, this mega shift from Christendom to post-Christendom that we're talking about here, does this, from their perspective, from the church perspective, does this mega shift seem true? Does it seem real to them? What are you observing there?
So I would say yes and no. So most of our churches, we serve about, 6,000 or 7,000 Christians at the camp, and that amounts to about 100 churches that come through in a given year. And then we have another probably 10 to 20 churches that are hardcore supporters and partners of our ministry. Mm-hmm. And then I spend a lot of time in my mobilizing efforts talking to pastors, mm-hmm. talking to church leaders about the conditions they face. And so most of our churches are in a post-COVID rebound of membership. And so when we start talking about things are getting post-Christian and less people are identifying as Christian, there is a sense that that's not the main issue on most pastors or most churches' burners right now. Mainly, there's two crises where I think they live. One is, what do I do with all these new people, and how can I get enough labor to continue and run this institution? Because even though the pews are full, there are actually less competent volunteers to run the institution, right? So that's maybe where the actual pain point is of most churches and pastors, and none of that seems like this mega shift. So they come to the camp and they have a retreat and they're pushing like, let's get some energy, let's rededicate, and hoping that trickles down to like volunteers and leadership roles and more effective ministry, which makes room for more people to come in. And so that's definitely where their consciousness is. However, I can point out two things to them that make it immediately real, the mega shift. One is, while they're doing this, anyone under the age of 25 is quietly sneaking out and getting on their phones in quiet places around our camp. And I walk by them hanging out in our lounges, lobbies, porches, fire rings out in the woods. While everybody in the institution is trying to build this up, there's a whole bunch of people that are saying, what I'm engaging on my device is more the conversation. And, it's saying, hey, this is irrelevant, right? So that's one place that shows up. The other place that it shows up is these pastors are starting to be aware that there are a bunch of holdouts. They go to the church, they believe in Jesus, they might even be some of the most gospel engaged people, most theologically formed people who are resisting volunteering or being a part of the institution at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And they're sitting on the margins. They go to the church because you're supposed to. They go to the church because they're looking for community and secretly hoping it will happen, but they're staying in the margins in that they don't want leadership. They don't want to plug in as a volunteer. They're not willing to give deeply. And that, although people may say, well, that's just, people being stubborn and rebellious. And I mean, you can frame that as sins. I would say one of the biggest pressures, though, that we're not talking about is actually post-Christendom behavior. But it's post-Christendom behavior within the church based on that penetration. And I would venture that if you went and had personal conversations with those people, they would be the people that use the language of I'm spiritual but not religious the most.
Even though they're in a religious context.
Right. And I meet all kinds of people that are that way. They're church, but in their heart, they're a post-church.
Interesting.
They love Jesus and they're there, but they're holding back being a part of the institution in a meaningful way because they disagree with it. They disagree with its machinery type feel. They disagree with its lack of relational sensitivity. A lot of them some of the very ones that would frame it very spiritually is they sense the spirit in among the people, but not in the institution. So they're at the church for the spirit in the people, but they very much resist leadership and resist the institutional layer because they don't sense the spirit being there. Now, whether that's actually the spirit, I don't know, but we have always, our imagination of what the spirit is and can do is formed by our culture.
So that leads to another question I had. In recent decades, one of the factors that I think just, at least been in my thinking, has to play a part in all this is the rising mistrust in institutions in general, all types of institutions. And every scandal, every leadership failure, banks, politicians, religious leaders, you name all across the board, it just reinforces the narrative. It's just this mistrust in institutions. And, it doesn't take much to go back in American history. I mean, I don't know, my parents, maybe definitely grandparents' generation, like they trusted these institutions, but we're at a time now where it's just this rising mistrust in institutions across the board. This has to affect the church. I mean, how much do you think this is part of the phenomenon that we're facing?
I think it's a huge part of the phenomenon. But I think that we need to shift or change our way of thinking about it a little bit and move out of the idea that this is a preferential shift. It's not a preferential shift. It's an existential shift. Right? In other words, people don't just prefer not to deal with the institutions because they feel a level of disgust. For most people, it's an existential or survival issue to distance themselves from the institutions. And if we understand that, the shift on that level, it changes the conversation a little bit. This isn't about how we can put lipstick on the pig and make the institution a little more appealing to people. We need to pay attention to why they view their anti-institutionism as an existential, very much core of who they are. And so some of this comes out of reactions to institutions related to postmodernism. Okay, so when we had the largest science-based, rational-based institutions on this planet, they brought humanity to the brink of extinction.
Yeah.
And the whole bohemian consciousness that started in Germany was picked up by the hippies, very much was in the grunge movement of Gen X, is still very much a part of postmodern thinking is a great holding to account institution. This idea that when men formalize things, when humanity formalizes things, do we get a better world?
Yeah.
Right. So we have to pay attention that that's an existential issue, an existential crisis. Then we went through, after World War II, we went through 2 generations that tried to reform institutions. Okay. And so this would be the meritocracy that said we can reform institutions by making them more consumer oriented, more, like consumption. Are you getting what you want out of it? And more performance based. Right. And so the whole consumer project was about, will institutions give you, the individual, what you want? But then we reacted against that and said, no, they won't. Everything's hollow and plastic and artificial. Think of that 1950s image of, with the credit card, you can fill your house with all these machines, and the wife with the pearl necklace and the A-line dress, vacuuming with the new vacuum cleaner. And, we have all kinds of what do we want to call it? Dystopian visions of how that went wrong. That then the next system tried to correct by saying, we're going to create equity networks instead. We're going to create institutions ruled by the elite that will make sure you get true access, not to consumption, but to true service. Right. But then what did that lead to? That led to the nanny state. That led to outcome-based education that we had to suffer through as children. That led to like healthcare systems that won't listen to a regular human in any way, shape, or form. That led to political bureaucracies that make judgments on high but don't listen to like local farmers. And so Gen X looked at that and said, institution in general is insensitive to our story and our identity. And part of the idea of what Gen X did with the internet was that if the institution's power is the maintenance of information, and we make information available to all, we will break the bonds of institution, right? And so that's the whole hacker paradigm. Everybody wants to hack their health and hack their yard and hack their DIY and maker and all this. Is the Gen X like anti-institutional? Let's go to my particular story. Let's go to my particular experience, my particular identity. And so being authentic for Gen X and younger means being anti-institutional. You define.
Yeah, because think about the hacker, the leaker. They're now heroes.
They're heroes. And not only that, the rapper.
And go back a couple of generations, that they would not have been.
Right. And in urban spaces, the rapper, right? The rapper, because he doesn't bow to the police as an institution, the government as an institution, the school as an institution, and although he takes their money, Hollywood, the music industry isn't even an institution he bows to, he gets respect.
Yeah.
So it's an urban story, but it's also a universal story.
Yeah. So Ben, I think when I look at the struggle with institutions and the way the church often has tried to operate as that really compassionate. I mean, when we're at our best, right? I mean, it's just this compassionate institution in the neighborhood. It's where people go for help. It's but then we now find ourselves in the situation where there's this rising mistrust and this just really struggle with institutions. And I look at this from 2 angles when I think about practical ministry. One is like the mission catalyst, the missionary, the church planter, the evangelist, right? So, and they're trying to imagine how to reach this growing community, this growing population of people that would describe themselves as unspiritual but not religious. That if you ask them what's your religion, they'd say nothing, and they're trying to figure out how to reach them. The other angle, of course, is we have existing churches, right? I mean, we have existing churches that have operated for a certain way for, in some cases, generations, or even a newer church that still operates the way we've always operated, and so let's take that first one, the church planter, the mission guy, the outreach person. If they're imagining how to reach a community in a city that would describe themselves as I'm spiritual but not religious, or even just completely secular, or just say nothing at all, I mean, how would you encourage them to approach that effort? So they're starting from scratch. They're going into a city and they want to develop some form of Christian community. They want to reach people. They want to make this. They've heard the call to make disciples, but here's this community that is considered kind of hard to reach, and they kind of some new phenomenon going on there. And again, the kind of I'm spiritual not religious crowd, they've taken seriously the impulse to reach out to their city evangelistically and not just start with transfer growth. What should they do? What do you think?
Right. Well, the biggest thing that I would say is contextualization is important, but don't start with contextualization. Don't start by thinking, hey, how do I make my content more palatable? Rather jettison that. Like really, really create a mercy space, like just space within yourself, and start with listening. You'll get better contextualization if you start with listening. It'll be
you're
more
not saying throw out contextualization, but listen first.
Right. Like it. So I mean, a lot of it is, when what do we mean by contextualization, right? So contextualization, the word itself means with, and then text is from textile, right? And it means to be woven together, right? And if you're trying to take all the cloth that you are and shove it into some other weave, it's not going to work. You need to let go of all that and just be a thread. You a thread and them a thread. And so much of like why I say your contextualization on the side is because we're trying to think, how can we make the Christian institution more relevant? How can we make the gospel more relevant? How can we make the Bible more relevant? Like all these things that represent our whole entire fabric. Trust a little bit that Jesus in you is enough, and all these things will get woven in at the right time. But start with listening. Start with creating the space to really listen. Sometimes I found I have to listen in a meaningful relationship with somebody for like 9 months and have the discipline to do that for like maybe 9 months. Other times it's like it doesn't have to be that long. But I spend a lot of time listening and thinking about what is that person, what's the geometry of what they're saying. Like I try to look at how they're tagging things. What are the symbols that they're using? And what are those symbols? How are they connected together? And what does that mean to the bigger picture? Why does that painter paint realism in oil? What does that mean? And until I can hear why he paints realistic portraiture, which is not in vogue in the modern art world, with oil paints, I don't really understand his story. So I don't know how he's reaching for heaven, right? Until I meet his mom, who got excommunicated by the church, see how he relates to his mom, see how that echoes in the socioeconomics of their life and down into his own self-perceptions and what's formed him. I don't really understand his situation. So you have to hold listening until you can tell their story as well as they can tell their story. And at the point where when you tell their story, they feel like it's a grace, like you're telling their story in a way that adds new love and light to it, you're not actually ready to build anything with them. No ministry, no group, no Bible study. You should start with really listening, and you will gain so much understanding of how to contextualize at that point. So we've done this. We've done this with entire communities of people. I mean, we have post-Christian groups that come to us, New Age, plant medicine and psychedelics, stuff they pick up from the TV. That's what we call Oprah-ish. Jews who are either Reformed Jews or ultra-Orthodox Hasidic Jews, and they're all in the same group. How could you possibly take church as we've known it and make it a little more relevant for that. That's an impossible task. You can't have all those people sitting in a room, all that diversity, all that post-Christendom with all of its complexity, and decide like, oh, we're going to make a little sexier church for them. What you can do is you can hear all these stories, and as you're seeing them spiritually and seeing how that connects to Jesus, who all things on heaven and all things on earth come together in him. So he's not afraid of the diversity of their thought. He's not afraid of the weirdness of their symbols. But if you put Jesus in there, not only will you be able to now contextualize the gospel for all these different groups, but you'll be surprised how quickly they're able to contextualize their spirituality to each other. And we've seen that in the course of maybe say 8 months to 9 months, you can create a whole Christian community out of all these diverse people that ministers to each other, because it all happened very organically. It all happened at once. Yeah.
And the starting point for that was listening deeply to their own stories, and then beginning to have it sound, if I'm hearing you right, like Jesus begins to step into their story, and they begin to have that encounter with him.
Right. In the same way that you need to hold space until you really can hear their story, you're not just holding space for your understanding. You're holding space for Jesus to show up.
Yeah.
And we often find that, on the spiritual warfare side of it, the prayer side of it, the gospel encounter, power encounter side of it, Jesus will start to show up right at the point where we understand our story enough that we're ready for God to do something with it.
Yeah.
And so it's amazing. Like, you're talking about post-Christendom people, he'll start showing up in their dreams, their visions. They'll start asking us, can I start studying the Bible?
Yeah.
They'll start forming chosen watch groups together.
Yeah.
I love
what you're saying right now, and here's why. Here's why I love what you just expressed, what you're just sharing, what you've witnessed, is that a lot of us, I think, in the pew and in the pulpit in America, what you just described, we think is only taking place in pre-Christian context over there somewhere, wherever there is, over there somewhere. And right here in your midst, here's folks that are, post-Christendom, Western, the crowd that the church thinks is so hard to reach, and they're having those same experiences. That's right. Fun.
It's fun, but the implication is, if you take a Westerner and put them in those contexts and tell them do your Western thing, they're also ineffective over there.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. So, logically, that means the
missions home.
The reason that this doesn't happen here is us, the ones that are trying to bring the gospel. The same as if you tried to put us in India or, rural China or someplace, or the Philippines, where these movements are happening. Right. And if I were to boil down to what's going on there, it has a lot to do with we think we know. And so we do without God. We think we know, so we have a lack of repentance in terms of being supple to be steered by God into the lives of other people.
Yeah.
I went through this journey where I had a lot of anxiety because the conversations I wanted to have with people weren't the conversations I was having. And I think that Christians, when you do evangelism training, the Christians almost precognitively know that this is what's going to happen. If I talk to my coworker or my neighbor, I'm not going to be able to have the conversation I want to have. Right. And I had that same anxiety. But what about the conversation of right now? How does Jesus enter the conversation of right now? What does it mean to manifest Jesus when you're not in control of the conversation?
Yeah, and that's one of the principles we talk about in the evangelism training that Global City Mission does for churches. Is one of the key principles is we have to meet people where they are, not where we want them to be. And that's true across the board, whether we're talking about post-Christendom, we're talking about someone who dropped out of church 6 months ago, whether we're talking about, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, atheist. Just whoever we're talking to, We have to meet them where they are rather than where we want them to be. And how often do our kind of memorized presentations are actually designed to meet someone where we want them to be, and instead meeting them where they actually are. And you know, another thing that we often share that I was thinking about as you were describing that is, especially talking about listening. I was just sharing this with the church recently that every culture, this is kind of a missions 101 thing. Every culture, every subculture, there are bridges to the gospel and barriers to the gospel. We have to be able to identify the bridges so we can cross them, share the gospel with people. But we also have to navigate those barriers. We're not watering down the gospel, but those barriers have to be navigated. But the thing that has to come first for us to enter into any cultural context, whatever it is, overseas, down the street, whatever cultural context we're entering into, we have to listen in order to identify what those bridges and barriers are. If we just assume them, we're often assuming wrong. You know, one of the stories I sometimes told is I was getting ready to talk to this Moroccan guy, so I'm getting my Islamics ready. Well, it turns out he had read a bunch of French postmodern philosophers. He had tried out atheism for a time. He was kind of into relativism. Like, I mean, I was just going, oh, this isn't the conversation I thought I was going to have. You know, if I'd bulldozed past it and not paid attention to what was happening in this conversation, you know, I totally would miss it. But, you know, but we have to listen to be able to identify what those bridges are, what those barriers are, how to navigate them. But a lot of times we kind of assume.
Right.
You know, I think that's often true. It's often, let me rephrase that. It's often true for me. You know, it's often true for me.
Yeah, right. And I find that, you know, a lot of the stuff that Jesus talked about of love and inner cultivation rings more true if you're going to actually do this work. I have appreciated working in post-institutional and post-Christendom context because it has really got me into the way of Jesus. Previously, I had the way of the Christian institution. That's what I was trained in. It's what worked. But when you get out of that, you have to really get out of the way of the Christian institution and really into the way of Jesus as a human being who was God.
Yeah.
How he has conversations with people, how he enters into their situation. That is really, really amazingly fruitful, even for my own life and who I am as a person.
Yeah.
So
Ben, that's it.
Yeah.
So I was going to say that's a great transition.
Okay.
Because I want to come at it now from the other angle.
Right.
And that is thinking about existing churches that have operated as local institutions in their community, in their city for decades, years, decades, even generations. What do you suggest for them? Because, you know, I mean, they have a life together. They're doing good in their community. You know, the members of that church love their church. They want to be part of God's mission in their city. You know, they don't want to just give up. So how did they, what would you suggest to them for reaching a community around them that probably has been ignoring them for a while? You know, what are your suggestions to them?
Right. Well,
they're not starting from scratch.
Ignoring them. That's interesting. I think that one of the things we have to do is talk about who's ignoring who. I mean, that's a little touchy. But, you know, my kids could say to me, by the way, I have 6 kids. It's one of the reasons I'm really busy. But I could say to my kids, like they say to me, I want to spend time with you, Daddy. I miss you. You're busy. I want to spend time with you. Right. And I could say, okay, you want to spend time with me? That's great. We're going to go play catch in the park. The thing is, if I did that, my kids would be really, really despondent because my kids are not the athletic type, and going and playing catch in the park is not what they want to do. And if I paid attention to them at all, I'd know that Some of them want to play out in the yard some kind of fantasy where we tromp around the woods fighting with sticks and with dragons and princesses and kings. And then others of them want to get on our video games and build a really amazing world in Minecraft and do that. And some of them want to talk about philosophy and physics. These are my teenagers. Don't think I've got like little kids doing that. They really want to get into what's wrong with society and talk politics. And, they're at the age where they actually want to, get a drink and have a burger with dad and talk about, I mean, like a non-alcoholic drink and a burger with dad and talk about, what's going on in the world. So like, I could say that I'm paying attention to my kids and go and play catch with them in the park. But the question is, am I really listening to them? And that's the problem. It isn't necessarily that churches want to ignore them or the community wants to ignore them. It's that institutions, as we've done them, about the time that we get enough resources to staff the program and run the program and make the program effective, is the time that the need shifts in the community and it's no longer responsive. Right? And so that's part of the issue. A church that worked so long to build this faithful institution and finally get the youth group and finally get the adult ministry and the prayer ministry and all that built, they build it and the neighborhood has changed while they were building. And now the people sitting in the pews live 45 minutes away in the exurbs and not in that neighborhood anymore, right? So again, the solution is to listen. Whoever you're trying to serve or you want to serve, go and listen to them, learn their story, and this is also key, involve them in their solution. If we don't have homeless people dreaming about how to cure homelessness, then we are not really practicing a Jesus methodology of helping them. If we don't have parents who are wondering, what does the kingdom of God have to do with parenting my children? What is the point of having some kind of parent supportive youth group or middle school age group, right? It's in the engaging people on that story level and showing them what Jesus has to do that can revive our programming, make our institution instantly relevant, and lead to movements out of institution into broad layers of society. Now, those movements will create new institutions. We don't have to worry about institution dying, but it would put the heart of what the gospel is not in a story that's told to keep an institution alive, but it would center us on the gospel being a story that institution helps to keep alive.
Yeah, because gospel, anytime you have a gospel movement, and we've seen this in like the missions world, mission leadership, we see this all over the world. Anywhere where there's a gospel movement, people organize, and there are Christian institutions, there's churches, there's mega churches, all kinds of things that grow out of that. And so maybe I appreciate what you just said there, that maybe like we don't need to worry about this institution of so much as if we get the gospel moving forward and really engaging these communities, then the different ways of organizing will come out of that.
Right. And one of the, in terms of what do we do at this point? I am not a deconstructionist. Like I believe that you teach a kid how to take the radio apart, but if you're really going to teach them, they need to really be able to bring it back together. If we only teach people how to deconstruct things, deconstruct Christianity, deconstruct institutions, what we end up is living in junk piles of things.
Well, I see that all the time. I mean, Ben, I've sat with guys that have, and let's be honest, they finished their seminary degree, or they've been through something, and then they begin deconstructing, and that's been a buzzword in the last, I don't know, maybe decade, is deconstructionism, and everyone's kind of talking about that, and then there's the people that are against deconstructing, and that's become a theme. But oftentimes I think the harm that is done is there isn't the reconstruction, there isn't the reconnection that takes place. And so if we're only into destroying, that's not really helping either.
Right. So, To give an example, there's a church that I recently visited, and they're using the model of, they have a pretty big building in the city, and in order to pay the mortgage for the church, they have tenants that are in part of the building that are in the healthcare sector and the childcare sector. And then they have another kind of quasi-tenant that the church kind of is subsidizing through real estate and by giving volunteers into, but they're also kind of paying rent, which is a community development association that has all kinds of services that reach out to the community. It's a great model. It's been a model that is like maximal Christian institution model, and a lot of urban churches have followed that path, and they're starting now to flirt with the idea of how do we talk about multiplication, how do we talk about gospel spread, because they see this problem of the programming can't keep speed with the changes or get into all the different layers that they're encountering, right? So the deconstruction that's necessary is deconstructing the institutional demands to the point that you can give the gospel precedence. So what does that look like? Well, if you have say you have an outreach minister, right? That outreach minister should spend at least as much time, if not twice the amount of time, developing new people to do outreach in the congregation as they spend running the outreach ministries. So that's using discipleship and multiplicative thinking for how you develop an outreach. But instead of the outreach minister greeting everyone and doing everything and keeping everything running, how do they train up the teenager, the young adult, this person, that person, the retiree to do that work? And because they've trained it as a human capacity, when through the outreach, like say you're running like a youth group or a middle school group, like after school group, and it's really like bursting at the seams, you have human capacity to expand into that. What does that look like to create, to branch that out into another group and another group? What does that look like to go into the parents layer? Like you get a human capacity to follow the gospel as fast as it may be necessary to serve these people, as fast as God wants to move. However, if you use the traditional institutional role where this outreach minister has to do all that himself, he's going to very much be a barrier to the growth. Like you said, there's bridges and barriers. He'll become the barrier. And the barrier is, I can't possibly do that because I'm already too busy running all this. Right? So you need enough deconstruction to take apart that barrier, but then immediate reconstruction with Jesus of, okay, then how do I, if I free up this time by shutting this thing down or taking a pause, how do I immediately take that rather than the deconstruction of I'm not going to do anything because we had these problems, so therefore it must be, defunct, wicked, whatever. How do you then instead shift to, okay, now how would I reinvest to build capacity in people? I mean, maybe that you find that you have so many teenagers now that are graduating out of the middle school program that you need multiple interest groups now of that middle school teenage space to be able to give opportunities to those leaders. And therefore you're creating more families who can connect to your church. So there's multiple ways to switch our thinking to make it truly spiritual. We should learn that our best spiritual weapon is actually repentance. And that repentance means responsiveness to God. You're willing to tear down anything, change any direction at any moment to be responsive to God.
That's good. I actually want to sit with that. That's really good. I think that, when I read through the gospel message, I mean, repentance is so central. And I think I love the way you framed that, Ben, because it really is just, what do we need to do? What do we need to tear down in order to respond to God? And it really is, putting, what did Carrie Underwood say? Jesus, take the wheel. It really is to put God in the driver's seat. Let the Holy Spirit lead, and then the structures we build, the things we do, the programs we launch, those are really serving that mission, and whatever way Jesus leads us.
Yeah, and one of the ways to think about this is we do want God to save the church. as much as we want God to save us, right?
Mm-hmm.
The win-lose divergence is always self-justification or justification in Christ, always.
Yeah.
And if
Yes. Yeah.
we try to self-justify our institutions, it will lead to the same hell that a person experiences if they try to self-justify.
Yeah.
But if instead we allow Christ to justify our institutions just as he would justify us, that's the kind of repentance that leads to life, leads to multiplication,
Yeah.
leads to city transformation. All
Yeah.
these things suddenly become possible because
Yeah.
we're not trying anymore to justify and save ourselves. Instead,
Yeah.
we're letting God bring his fullness into whatever it is that we're doing.
Yeah, I've often reflected on, pretty famous passage where Jesus says in Mark, where he says, people are Sabbath is made for people, not people for the Sabbath. And it's this idea that the institution of Sabbath was there for human flourishing. Even livestock, servants, everybody, everyone stops, rests. It's restorative. But the legalism of the time had built around this institution, this idea that the people almost were serving it, to keep this, let it thrive, and people became servants to this institution, to this ritual, and it was, Jesus never says that it was bad. The institution of Sabbath was for human flourishing. It was to help human civilization, humans thrive, and for equity and for health. It stopped forced labor for a solid day. I mean, everything paused, and it was for human flourishing. And when any kind of institution that we build today, any organization, any ministry, any program, anything that we do, um, that humans become a cog in the wheel instead of that entity serving the flourishing of humans as part of God's kingdom, then we've lost our way. Um, and that the structures we build, the things that we do, the projects we launch are always about serving God's kingdom, and God's kingdom is about bringing about the flourishing of humans, and of course connection with God.
Right. And in my mind, people may ask, and I have on my darker days, how could God allow America and Europe to fall into post-Christendom?
Mm,
How could he let this happen? We
mm,
were in the project of making the whole world Christian, and he let
mm,
this happen.
mm,
And the great tragedy would be, what if we got to the end of the Christian project and we realized it wasn't Christian the whole time?
mm.
This is actually, I'm thankful for post-Christendom. I'm thankful for this because it makes us, it's really a grinder that makes us question, are we keeping a Sabbath that isn't any good for man anymore?
Yeah, yeah.
Or
Well, and in the bigger scheme of things too, right? Like globally, while we're having this conversation in Western societies about post-Christendom, the majority world is talking about a Christian faith that is post-colonial.
right,
Um, and increasingly, the missionary force in the world is from the majority world. And so that's happened. Like, God is moving all around the world, and here in the West, we're having to rethink in some ways that is probably healthy for us. And
right,
it's an opportunity to maybe rediscover aspects of the gospel that maybe were easy to ignore.
right. That's a big part of my life. The camp that I'm running is owned by the 18 Mennonite churches of New York City,
Mm-hmm.
and of those churches, only four of them speak English in their Sunday service.
Mm-hmm.
And so these churches are immigrant founded churches, majority
Mm-hmm.
world churches. And in a lot of ways, they know how to do mission, and they want to use this place to do mission. One of the struggles of this place has been it's using very Western institutional structures,
Mm-hmm.
and we've kind of shoehorned them into that. That's
Mm-hmm.
I'm in these conversations everywhere, denominational levels,
Mm-hmm.
institutions like mission sending agencies, and like the people from the city that are from the majority world and have that heritage are saying, hey, you're still not listening to us. You're
Mm-hmm.
still not hearing our story. You can't see.
Mm-hmm.
You're still shoehorning us into your story. You're still hoping that we'll come and continue your story? What about God's story? What about the way that we tell it? And so, yeah, it is very much a needed cataclysm. And what we'll get if we listen, what we get if we'll have the ears to hear this, is the fellowship of the true gospel story, one that all nations will be discipled, all nations will come into the kingdom, and not
Yeah.
one where one nation and one culture tried to subdue the whole planet to its version of the truth.
Yeah. Well, that's a good word to end on. Ben, thanks so much for taking the time. It's a good conversation. I hope people are challenged by it, but I also hope that those that listen will find hope that the surrounding kind of phenomenon of post-Christendom and non-religious and the changes that are taking place and the emerging culture around the church in North America and beyond, it's not unreachable. The gospel is still changing hearts. The gospel is still transforming lives. And if you'd like to know more about engaging your city with the gospel, we would love to hear from you at www.globalcitymission.org. Thank you so much. This has been the Global City Mission podcast.